He thought he owned the courtroom, until the courtroom decided to reveal who truly did. The air inside the Chicago District Courtroom felt heavier than usual, like something unseen was pressing down on every shoulder in the room. The fluorescent lights humming softly above rows of polished wooden benches, the faint echo of footsteps and shuffling papers blending into a low, constant murmur that never quite settled into silence. And at the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Brooks, posture rigid, jaw tight, his uniform crisp and badge gleaming under the cold light, a man who carried himself like the law didn't just pass through him but belonged to him. Like every command he gave was final, and every person in that room existed somewhere beneath his authority. And across from him, just a few feet away, stood a woman no one seemed to notice until he made them notice her. Angela Carter, dressed simply, no flash, no attempt to stand out. Her presence quiet but steady. The kind of stillness that didn't beg for attention, yet somehow held its ground against the noise of the room, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Her eyes focused not on the crowd, not on the judge, but somewhere deeper, as if she were watching something no one else could see. And for a brief moment, it almost felt like the room hesitated, like something was about to shift. But then Daniel's voice cut through that fragile pause, sharp and dismissive, dripping with the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned. "You don't belong here," he said, loud enough for the nearby spectators to hear, and a few quiet chuckles rippled through the benches, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that feeds power without anyone realizing it. And Angela didn't respond, not with words, not with movement, just a slight tilt of her head, as if acknowledging the sound without accepting the meaning behind it. And that silence, that refusal to react, seemed to irritate him more than anything she could have said. Because silence doesn't give you something to fight, it gives you something to doubt. And doubt was not something Daniel Brooks was used to feeling. So he stepped closer, his boots echoing against the tiled floor, closing the distance in a way that made the moment feel tighter, more controlled, more his. And the room watched, some curious, some indifferent, most unwilling to intervene, because moments like these had a way of blending into routine, into something people convinced themselves was normal. And then it happened, quick, abrupt, a movement meant to assert control rather than cause harm, a gesture that said more about power than anything else. And Angela shifted slightly from the contact, not collapsing, not reacting the way the room expected, just absorbing the moment as if it had already passed in her mind before it ever happened. And then came the silence, heavier this time, stretching across the courtroom like a held breath, the kind that makes people glance at each other without knowing why, because something about it felt off, like a line had been crossed, but no one could quite explain where it was. And Daniel straightened, exhaling through his nose, convinced the moment was over, that whatever message he intended had been delivered. But Angela remained exactly where she was, posture unchanged, expression calm. And in that stillness, there was something else now, something subtle but undeniable, not fear, not anger, but certainty, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it already knows how the story ends. And somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, footsteps approached, steady, deliberate, the kind that didn't rush because it didn't need to, and without realizing it, without anyone saying a word, the entire room began to shift its attention toward a truth that hadn't been spoken yet, but was already on its way. The sound of those approaching footsteps did not rush, did not echo with urgency, but carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls themselves. And one by one, heads began to turn, not out of curiosity at first, but instinct, the kind that whispers something important is about to unfold before the mind can explain it. And Daniel Brooks felt it too, though he would never admit it. A subtle shift in the air that made his shoulders stiffen just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the courtroom doors for a fraction of a second before returning to the woman in front of him, determined to hold on to control, to keep the moment exactly where he believed it belonged. But control is fragile when it is built on assumptions, and assumptions have a way of cracking without warning. And Angela Carter remained still, her breathing even, her gaze steady, not fixed on Daniel anymore, but drifting past him as if she already knew who was about to walk through that door, as if she had been waiting for this exact second long before anyone else in the room realized it mattered. And the murmurs that had once carried quiet amusement began to fade. replaced by a low uncertainty, people shifting in their seats, glancing at one another, sensing that the story they thought they were watching was beginning to change shape, and then the courtroom doors opened, not with force, not with drama, but with a calm, deliberate motion that drew every eye without needing to demand attention, and the man who stepped inside did not raise his voice, did not rush forward, yet the space seemed to rearrange itself around him. A senior officer in a dark uniform, posture straight, expression unreadable, the kind of presence that carried authority without needing to announce it. And suddenly the room that had felt loud with judgment just moments ago grew quiet in a different way, not passive, not indifferent, but aware, deeply aware, and Daniel felt it again, stronger this time. That flicker of something unfamiliar tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first crack in certainty, because authority recognizes authority, even before it is named, and for the first time since the moment began, he hesitated, just for a second, his voice no longer cutting as sharply through the air as it had before, and Angela took a slow breath, almost unnoticeable, but it grounded her even more firmly in the center of everything unfolding, her silence no longer empty, but full, carrying meaning that had not yet been spoken but was already understood on some level by everyone present, and the judge, who had remained distant, detached behind the bench, now straightened slightly, eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together what had shifted, because something had, something undeniable, something that could not be reversed, and the officer who had entered took another step forward, then another, each one measured, each one deliberate, until he stopped just inside the courtroom, his gaze sweeping across the scene, taking in Daniel, the crowd, and finally Angela, and in that moment, the silence became absolute, the kind that settles so deeply it feels almost heavy in the chest, and Daniel swallowed, barely noticeable, but real, his grip on the moment loosening in ways he could not explain, because for the first time, he was no longer the one defining what happened next, and Angela, still calm, still composed, allowed the silence to stretch just a little longer, because sometimes the most powerful moment is not the action, not the words, but the space right before everything changes. The silence held for one more second, then two, stretching just long enough for discomfort to settle into every corner of the room. And the senior officer finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not need volume to command attention. "Officer Brooks," he said, not loudly. Yet every person in the courtroom heard it as if it had been directed at them. And Daniel turned fully now, his posture instinctively adjusting, shoulders squaring not out of confidence, but out of habit, the reflex of someone who had always operated within a system where rank defined reality. And for a brief moment, he tried to reclaim control of the narrative, his voice firm. "This is being handled," he replied, but the words did not land the way they usually did. They did not settle into authority. They floated, uncertain, because something about the moment refused to accept them as final. And the officer's gaze did not shift, did not soften. Instead it remained steady, measured. The kind of look that evaluates rather than reacts. And then he took one step closer, just enough to shift the center of the room away from Daniel and toward himself. And in that subtle movement, the balance of power began to tilt. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but undeniably, and Angela Carter exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxed, not in relief, but in readiness, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived exactly as expected, and the courtroom seemed to feel it too. The quiet now charged, no longer empty but filled with anticipation, the kind that makes people sit a little straighter, breathe a little slower, because something important is about to be revealed, and the officer turned his attention toward Angela. Not with surprise, not with confusion, but with recognition, a small, almost imperceptible nod passing between them, a silent acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any spoken introduction, and Daniel noticed it, that brief exchange, and for the first time, a real question formed in his mind, not spoken, not fully understood, but present, pressing against his certainty, because recognition is not given lightly in rooms like this. And whatever connection existed between them did not fit into the version of events he believed he was controlling, and the judge shifted again behind the bench, clearing his throat slightly, as if preparing to regain structure, to bring the room back under formal order. But even that attempt felt delayed, out of sync with the current unfolding, because structure only works when everyone agrees on who holds it. And right now, that agreement was dissolving, piece by piece. And the officer finally spoke again, his voice still even, but now carrying a clarity that cut clean through the tension. "I think it would be best if we pause proceedings for a moment," he said, and no one objected, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Daniel, because something in the tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, it was a transition, and transitions are where control changes hands. And Daniel felt it fully now, that shift he had tried to ignore, that quiet unraveling of certainty, his gaze flicking back to Angela, searching for something, an explanation, a reaction, anything that would place her back into the role he had assigned to her just minutes ago. But she offered none of it, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. Yet now there was something unmistakable in her presence, something that had been there all along but only now could be seen for what it was, authority, not loud, not aggressive, but grounded, undeniable. And it did not come from the room, it did not come from the crowd, it came from within her. And the realization began to settle in layers, slow but irreversible, because the most dangerous shift is not the one you see coming. It is the one you understand too late. And as the officer reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, holding it carefully, deliberately, the entire courtroom seemed to lean into the moment without moving, every eye fixed on what was about to be said. And Daniel's breath slowed, his mind racing ahead of the present, trying to catch up to a truth that had already arrived, because deep down, before the words were spoken, before the title was revealed, before the room fully understood what was happening, he already knew that whatever came next would not restore his control, it would end it. The paper did not shake in the officer's hand, not even slightly, and that alone told the room everything it needed to know before a single word was spoken, because uncertainty always finds its way into small movements, into the edges of control. But there was none of that here, only precision, only intent. And as he unfolded the document slowly, deliberately, the faint sound of paper against paper seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in a courtroom that had gone completely still. And Daniel Brooks felt the shift fully now, not as a thought, not as a theory, but as something real, something irreversible pressing against his chest, tightening the space around him in a way he could not step out of. And his eyes locked onto that document, as if understanding it before it was even read might somehow change what it contained. But truth does not wait for permission, and it does not soften itself for those unprepared to face it. And the officer lifted his gaze, not to Daniel, not to the judge, but to the room as a whole, because what he was about to say was not just for one man. It was for everyone who had witnessed the moment unfold and chosen silence, effective immediately. He began, his voice steady, carrying across the room without force. "All proceedings are to be temporarily suspended under directive of the Chicago Police Department." And a ripple moved through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable, people shifting, breaths catching, the first visible sign that the structure they had trusted was no longer fixed. And Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to object, to reclaim something, but no words came, because deep down he already knew that whatever this was, it was beyond him, beyond the authority he thought he held just minutes ago. And then the officer turned, fully this time, toward Angela Carter, and the room followed that movement instinctively, every eye landing on her at once. But she did not react, did not step forward, did not claim attention. She simply stood there, grounded, as if she had been standing in that exact moment long before anyone else arrived. And the officer spoke again, but now his tone carried something different, something unmistakable, not announcement, not explanation, but recognition. "Ma'am," he said, a single word, but the shift it created was immediate, visible, because respect spoken at the right moment does not ask for attention, it commands it. And Daniel felt it like a drop in altitude, sudden, disorienting, his mind scrambling to align what he was seeing with what he believed, because the two no longer matched. And the officer took one step to the side, just enough to clear the space in front of her, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but purposefully, creating a line of sight that had not existed before. And in that space, Everything became clear without yet being said, the silence stretching once more, but this time it was not uncertain. It was precise, intentional, the kind of silence that carries a reveal inside it, waiting for the exact second to unfold. And Angela finally moved, not quickly, not forcefully, just one step forward, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But now the weight of her presence filled the room in a way it had not before, because context changes everything. And as she reached into her bag, retrieving a small, official credential holder, the simple motion seemed to echo louder than any command that had been given that day, and she opened it with quiet certainty, holding it at a height that required no exaggeration, no emphasis, because the truth does not need to be pushed forward when it is already undeniable. And the officer's voice followed, completing what had already begun to settle into every corner of the courtroom. "Allow me to introduce," he said, each word measured, each word landing exactly where it needed to, "Chief Angela Carter." And for a moment, nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just a complete and total stillness, as if the room itself needed time to process the shift, because the woman who had been dismissed, questioned, and pushed aside just minutes ago now stood, revealed as the highest authority in the very system that had been used against her. And Daniel Brooks froze, not out of instruction, not out of discipline, but because there was nowhere left to move, nowhere left to stand that still made sense. And in that silence, louder than any voice, the truth settled in, fully, final, unchangeable, and the balance of power did not just shift, it inverted. No one moved, not at first, because the kind of silence that follows truth is not empty. It is heavy, it is final, and it settles into the room like something permanent, something that cannot be undone no matter how badly someone wishes to rewind the last few minutes. And Daniel Brooks stood exactly where he was, his body still locked in the posture of authority he had carried so confidently before. But now it no longer fit, it no longer matched the reality forming around him, and that mismatch began to show in the smallest ways, in the tightening of his jaw, in the slight shift of his weight, in the way his eyes flickered not with command but with calculation, trying to find a version of this moment where he still held control, but there was none left to find. And Angela Carter closed her badge slowly, deliberately, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who never needed to prove anything in the first place. And as she lowered her hand, the weight of her presence seemed to expand, filling the space that had once been dominated by noise, by judgment, by assumptions that no longer had any place to stand. And the judge cleared his throat again, this time more firmly, attempting to restore structure, to pull the moment back into something recognizable. "Chief Carter," he said, his tone measured but noticeably more careful, more aware. "This is highly irregular." And Angela turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice steady when she spoke. "What is irregular," she said, not raising her volume, not needing to, "is what happened before I was introduced." And the words landed with a clarity that cut deeper than any accusation, because they did not exaggerate, they did not dramatize, they simply pointed to a truth that everyone in the room had witnessed and chosen not to challenge. And that truth now stood exposed, undeniable. And Daniel felt it fully, not just the shift in power, but the shift in perspective. The sudden awareness that the moment he thought was routine had been anything but, that every action he took had been seen, evaluated, and now carried consequences that extended far beyond this courtroom. And for the first time, his voice came not from authority, but from uncertainty. "I did not know," he said, the words quieter than anything he had spoken before, and Angela's gaze met his, not cold, not angry, but firm, grounded in something deeper than emotion. "That is exactly the problem," she replied, and there was no pause after that, no hesitation, because the meaning was already clear, the weight already understood, and the officer who had brought the document stepped forward again, holding it out now not as a signal, but as a formal action. And Daniel looked at it, really looked this time, not trying to anticipate it, not trying to control it, but seeing it for what it was, an official notice, precise, structured, and final in its intent. And the room watched, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, because this was no longer a moment of tension, It was a moment of consequence, and Angela took a single step closer, not to intimidate, not to assert dominance, but to stand within the space where truth had already settled, and her voice, when she spoke again, carried the same calm authority that had been present from the beginning. "This department is not built on assumptions," she said, "and it is not sustained by silence." And each word seemed to anchor itself into the room, into the people, into the system itself, because statements like that do not just describe a moment, they redefine it. And Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not out of submission, but because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret, the reality in front of him no longer flexible, no longer negotiable. And as the officer extended his hand for the badge that had once symbolized everything Daniel believed he controlled, the room did not react, did not whisper, did not shift, because sometimes the loudest moment is the one where no one says anything at all. And in that silence, deeper than before, more final than anything that had come earlier, the truth did not just exist. It prevailed. Daniel Brooks did not move right away, not because he did not understand what was happening, but because understanding it meant accepting it. And acceptance is the hardest step when everything you believed about your position, your authority, your place in the system begins to dissolve in front of you. And his hand hovered for just a fraction of a second near his badge, that small piece of metal that had once carried weight, respect, control, and now felt heavier than it ever had before, not with power, but with consequence. And the officer standing in front of him did not rush, did not demand, because moments like this do not need force. They unfold on their own, driven by the truth that has already taken hold. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Daniel reached up and unclipped the badge from his uniform, the faint metallic sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the courtroom. And as he placed it into the officer's hand, something shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not just for him, but for everyone watching, because symbols matter, and when a symbol of authority is handed over in silence, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. And Angela Carter watched, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that comes from seeing a process unfold exactly as it should, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. And the courtroom remained still, every person present now fully aware that they were witnessing something far more significant than a single interaction. They were witnessing a correction, a moment where the system, flawed as it may be, chose to realign itself with its own principles. And the judge leaned back slightly, his earlier confidence replaced with careful observation, as if recognizing that this moment was no longer his to control, and that realization carried its own weight, because authority is not always where it appears to be, and sometimes it arrives quietly, without announcement, only revealing itself when it is too late to ignore. And Daniel lowered his hand after releasing the badge, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by the certainty he had carried into the room. And for a moment, he seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence, as if the space he once filled had contracted around him, leaving him to stand within a reality he had not prepared for. And Angela took one step forward, closing the distance just enough to speak without raising her voice, her tone calm, steady, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. "This is not about punishment," she said, her eyes steady on him. "It is about accountability." And the distinction settled into the room with quiet force, because punishment can be argued. It can be debated, but accountability stands on truth, and truth does not require approval to exist. And Daniel met her gaze again, this time without defiance, without assumption, but with something closer to realization, the slow recognition of what had actually happened, not just in the last few minutes, but in the patterns that led to them, the choices made without question, the authority exercised without reflection. And for the first time, he did not respond, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to reinterpret. Only the reality in front of him, clear and unfiltered. And the officer who had taken the badge stepped back slightly, holding it with care, not as a trophy, not as a symbol of victory, but as evidence of a process completed. And Angela turned her attention briefly to the room, her gaze moving across the faces that had once watched in silence, in judgment, in indifference, and now sat in quiet reflection, because moments like this do not just affect the individuals at the center, They ripple outward, forcing everyone present to reconsider what they saw, what they allowed, and what they might do differently the next time. And the silence that followed was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was steady, grounded, the kind of silence that comes after something important has been understood. And as Daniel stood there, no longer defined by the badge he once carried, he faced a different kind of weight, not one imposed by others, but one that comes from within, the weight of realization, of consequence, of truth that does not disappear when the moment ends. And in that space, where authority had been stripped down to its foundation, what remained was not power, not control, but something far more lasting, the beginning of accountability. The room did not return to normal, because moments like this do not end cleanly. They linger, they reshape the air long after the action has passed, and every person in that courtroom could feel it, the quiet recalibration of what they had just witnessed, not just an officer losing his badge, but a system revealing something deeper about itself, something that had always been there, but rarely seen so clearly. And Angela Carter stood at the center of that realization, not elevated by the moment, not changed by it, but aligned with it, as if this outcome had never been in question. And she turned slightly, her gaze moving beyond Daniel now, toward the rows of spectators, the attorneys, the officers lining the back wall, each face carrying a different version of the same realization. That silence is not neutral, that inaction has weight, and that weight had just been exposed in front of all of them. And she took a slow breath before speaking again, not louder, not sharper, but with a clarity that settled into every corner of the room. What happened here today was not a single mistake, she said, her voice even, measured. It was a pattern, and the word hung in the air, heavier than anything before it, because patterns are harder to deny, harder to excuse. They do not belong to one moment, they belong to many. And as she spoke, a few eyes dropped, not out of guilt alone, but out of recognition, because they had seen moments like this before, maybe smaller, maybe quieter, but similar enough to understand what she meant without needing explanation. And Daniel remained still, his focus no longer on defending himself, but on absorbing what was being said, each word landing differently now, not as opposition, but as truth. And Angela continued, her tone steady, her presence grounding the entire room. A system does not fail all at once, she said. It fails in pieces, in moments where people choose not to see, not to speak, not to act. And the courtroom seemed to shrink slightly around those words, not physically, but emotionally, as if everyone present was being asked to stand inside that statement and recognize their place within it. And the judge shifted again, this time not to regain control, but to listen, his earlier distance replaced by a more deliberate attention, because authority, when confronted with truth, either resists or evolves. And in this moment, resistance had no place to stand, and Angela turned her gaze back to Daniel, not to single him out, but to complete the circle of the moment. You were not alone in this, she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. And that is why this matters. And Daniel nodded slightly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, the kind that comes when denial is no longer possible. And the officer who had taken the badge remained at the edge of the scene, silent, observant, holding not just an object, but the symbol of everything that had shifted. And Angela took one final step back, allowing the space to open again, not to retreat, but to let the moment settle fully into the room, because not every conclusion needs to be forced, some need to be absorbed. And the silence that followed was different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but reflective, the kind that lingers in people long after they leave, the kind that changes how they see the next moment, the next decision, the next time they are faced with something they could ignore or confront. And as Daniel stood there, no longer defined by rank or authority, he faced something far more lasting, the understanding that what had happened was not just about him, but about a system that had just been forced to look at itself. And in that realization, quiet but undeniable, something had begun to change, not loudly, not instantly, but in a way that would not easily be undone, because truth, once seen, does not disappear, it stays, it echoes, and it demands to be remembered. The silence did not break, it evolved, settling into something deeper than reflection, something closer to awareness. And as the weight of Angela Carter's words continued to echo through the courtroom, people began to shift in ways that were almost imperceptible, a slight straightening of posture, a longer pause before movement, the kind of subtle changes that signal something internal has been unsettled. And Angela remained still for a moment longer, allowing that shift to take hold, because she understood something most in the room were only beginning to realize, that change does not happen in the loudest moment. It happens in the quiet one that follows, the one where people are forced to sit with what they have seen, what they have allowed, and what they can no longer ignore. And Daniel Brooks stood in that silence, no longer at the center of attention, yet still deeply within the center of consequence. His presence now defined not by command, but by contrast, the difference between who he believed himself to be and what had just been revealed. And for a brief second, his eyes moved across the room, not searching for support, but noticing something he had never paid attention to before, the way people looked at him now, not with fear, not with respect, but with something quieter, something more honest, recognition. And it settled in slowly. The understanding that authority built on assumption can disappear in an instant, but the impact of those assumptions remains, lingering in the spaces they once controlled. And Angela finally turned away from him, not dismissively, not out of disregard, but because the moment was no longer about him alone. It had expanded. It had grown beyond a single interaction into something that touched everyone present. And she addressed the room once more, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a tone that felt less like correction and more like direction. What you witnessed today, she said, is not the end of something. And a slight pause followed, just enough for the words to settle. It is the beginning of accountability. And the distinction mattered, because endings allow people to move on, to forget, to separate themselves from what happened, but beginnings require participation, they require action, they demand that people carry the moment forward into what comes next. And a few heads lifted slightly, eyes focusing with a new kind of attention, not passive, not distant, but engaged, because the responsibility had just shifted, no longer confined to a single person, no longer isolated to a single act, but shared across the system itself. And the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression more grounded now, more aligned with the tone of the room, as if recognizing that his role was no longer to control the moment, but to uphold what it had revealed. And the officer holding the badge remained still, waiting, not for instruction, but for the natural conclusion of something that had already reached its turning point. And Angela's gaze moved once more across the courtroom, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging all of them, because accountability is not selective. It does not choose its audience. It includes everyone willing to see it. And as she took a step back, allowing the space to breathe again, the tension that had once filled the room was no longer sharp, no longer volatile. It had transformed into something steadier, something more grounded, the kind of tension that does not push outward, but inward, forcing reflection, forcing awareness, forcing change. And Daniel remained where he was. But even in stillness, he was no longer the same. Because understanding had replaced assumption. And understanding carries a weight that cannot be ignored once it is felt. And as the courtroom slowly began to move again, quietly, carefully, as if aware that every action now held more meaning than before, the moment did not disappear. It did not fade into routine. It stayed, embedded in the air, in the people, in the system itself, a reminder that authority is not proven by control, but by how it responds when control is no longer possible. And in that realization, calm but undeniable, the foundation of something new had already begun to form. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not collapse into noise or reaction. Instead, it moved forward in a way that felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if every person present understood that something had shifted beneath their feet, and that rushing past it would only mean missing what it truly meant. And Angela Carter stood quietly for one last moment, not to be seen, not to be acknowledged, but to let the weight of what had just happened settle fully into the room. Because moments like this are not about the person who stands at the center of them. They are about what remains after they are gone. And she turned without urgency, without ceremony, taking a few calm steps toward the exit, her presence no longer needing to command attention because it had already redefined it. And as she moved, something subtle followed her, not physically, but in the way the room held onto the truth she had revealed, like an echo that refused to fade. And Daniel Brooks remained where he was, no longer frozen, but still, his eyes no longer searching for control, but reflecting something deeper, something quieter, the kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once, but builds in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. And he looked down at his empty uniform where the badge had once rested, and for the first time, it was not the absence of authority that stood out to him. It was the absence of awareness that had been there all along, the realization that power without reflection is not strength. It is vulnerability waiting to be exposed, and the courtroom continued to move around him, papers being gathered, voices returning in low, careful tones, but nothing felt the same, not the air, not the space, not the people, because once a truth is seen clearly, it changes the way everything else is perceived. And the judge finally spoke again, his voice measured, steady, but now carrying a tone that aligned with what had just been established, not above it, not separate from it, but within it. And the proceedings began to reorganize, not as they were before, but as they needed to be now, grounded in a reality that could no longer be ignored. And as the officer who had taken the badge stepped aside, holding it not as an object of loss, but as a marker of accountability, Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that comes when a moment has fully settled and there is nothing left to resist, only something to understand, and he did not speak again, because some lessons are not meant to be explained, they are meant to be carried. And as Angela reached the doors and stepped beyond them, the light from the hallway briefly spilling into the room before the doors closed behind her, the final shift completed itself, quiet, precise, and lasting. And what remained inside that courtroom was not the memory of a confrontation, but the imprint of a truth, one that would follow every person who had witnessed it long after they left. Because the most powerful kind of justice is not loud, it does not demand attention, it reveals itself, and when it does, it leaves behind a single, undeniable realization. That authority is not proven by who you can control, but by what you choose to see, and what you choose to change when the truth stands right in front of you.